Bom dia a todos. Hoje é dia 29 de outubro de 2021. Estamos aqui na 7ª edição do 𝗤𝗲𝘀𝘀𝗀𝗶, Encontro Internacional de Preservação e Memória, evento promovido pela Memória da Eletricidade, que nesse ano discute arquivos pessoais e história de vida. Eu sou Ana Paula 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀, vou mediar a mesa dessa manhã, que tem como tema a história oral e a arte da escuta. E para falar sobre esse assunto, nós temos o enorme prazer de receber aqui o historiador italiano 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, um dos mais importantes especialistas em história oral. Bom, ele dispensa apresentações, mas eu vou falar bem rapidinho. O 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 é professor de literatura anglo-americana na Universidade de Roma, 𝗏 𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀, fundou e é presidente do Circolo Gianni Bosio, dedicado à pesquisa de música e cultura populares. Foi conselheiro para a Memória Histórica da Prefeitura de Roma e professor de Princeton University. Publicou vários textos no Brasil, em revistas científicas, em coletâneas, como seu conhecido trabalho sobre o massacre de 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀, que está no livro Usos e Abusos de História Oral, mas ele publicou também livros aqui, os ensaios de História Oral e Arte da Escuta, que tem o mesmo título aqui do nosso encontro de hoje. Bom, sem mais delongas, eu vou passar a palavra ao professor 𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, afinal estamos aqui para ouvi-lo. Gostaria só de avisar que após a apresentação eu vou abrir o debate, então quem quiser pode enviar perguntas pelo chat do YouTube, que ao final, se possível, se tivermos tempo, a gente repassa aqui para o professor. Welcome, Professor 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. It's good to see all the new friends and to be with you, at least in this form. And I hope we can have a good conversation. So you suggested that I introduce the topic in general terms, and then we have a conversation. We have questions and answers and an exchange. Well, since we're talking about electricity, perhaps a turning point in the history of the alternative presence and critical awareness of people's cultures, of working class culture, was formalized in an essay by Gianni Bosio. Gianni Bosio was an independent cultural organizer and historian, and we named our organization after him. In 1966, he wrote an essay called In Praise of the Tape Recorder. That is, it all begins with a machine that runs by electricity. And what he said was, well, for hundreds of years, the culture of the non-hegemonic classes, of the popular classes, has gone unstudied, stereotyped, mainly because, well, we didn't have a way of documenting it and seriously studying and analyzing it. And this is what this electrical machine did for us and for the culture and for working class culture and popular cultures all over the world. It allows us to freeze the flow of the spoken word, and so that we can do with sound what for thousands of years scholars have been doing with writing. That is, parse it, analyze it, study it, listen over and over again. That is, do a critical study of the forms of expression of the popular classes. And this was really not the beginning of oral history, certainly not internationally. I'm thinking of the Writers' Project in the United States in the 1930s. There had been collections of life stories in Italy in the 50s. But the beginning of oral history as somehow a tool for questioning the established form of historical research. What Bosio insisted on was that, well, the study of the popular classes must be, is best carried out by using the sources generated within the popular classes. In the past, of course, we had ethnologists, we had a wealth of representations of the popular world in the official archives, and somehow some of the words of the non-hegemonic classes had filtered into the written record, but always through some kind of filter. But like an example, one source for the testimony of the presence of the popular classes has always been court records. What, you know, I'm thinking, for instance, of 𝗔𝗵𝗀𝗀𝘀𝗀𝗀's extraordinary work on witch trials. But as 𝗔𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 says, what we have is not their words, it's a transcription or description by a court official, by a representative of power. Therefore, in a way, what we had was more like what the ruling classes could perceive as they looked at the popular classes or try to listen to them. The tape recorder generated a new season in oral history and a new season in folk song research, of course, and folk music revival and oral history proceeded together in the history of the Italian radical movements as ways of questioning the established, not just the established narratives, but also the monopoly of the ruling classes, of the educated over the representation of the uneducated, the monopoly of the leaders over the representation of the rank and file. There's a classic episode shortly after Gianni Bosio wrote this essay. Another of the founders of Italian oral history, 𝗔𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, who was an activist in the Communist Party, started going to Communist Party meetings carrying the tape recorder, and this went straight against the narrative, the so-called democratic centralism, which erased all forms of debate, dissension, and only represented the final, the line of path. And Gianni Bosio says, and so he was asked to please remove the machine. And Gianni Bosio, in another famous passage, says, when we have a leadership that wishes to exercise the tape recorder, then it's time to exercise the leadership. So this was the way in which oral history broke into the political and cultural environment as a way of not of giving voice to the popular classes, because they already had the voice. If they didn't have the voice, we wouldn't have anything to record, but of listening and critically studying and knowing, and in a way returning with a heightened critical awareness to what the popular world had to say about itself. Of course, there is also such a thing as elite oral history. The Oral History Office at Columbia University, for instance, was founded in 1949 exactly with the task of interviewing important people in politics and business, as if documenting, the behind-the-scenes narrative in the history of the ruling classes. The Italian sound archives were created under fascism, 1926, by 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘀𝘀 and their task was to preserve the voice of the great men. So we had, for years and years, they recorded generals and politicians. What oral history has done since the beginning, I was talking about the Federal Writers Project. Well, the Federal Writers Project began by interviewing. They didn't have a tape recorder yet, but that was a problem. But began by interviewing former slaves, and this was the first time that the slave testimony had been taken seriously. So seriously, there was more than 30 years before a historian could actually go to those interviews and write a new way of reconstructing the history of slavery. 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘀𝘀 and from sundown to sunup. So this is the way it began, and immediately, because it was perceived as something threatening to the established cultural and political hierarchies, let's call it the institutions, the profession of history, took a very negative attitude and raised a number of criticisms, not unfounded. How can you oral sources are unreliable, memory fades. How do you generalize from one personal narrative to the social scene? Doesn't the interviewer contaminate the purity of the source? And the real scandal was, in fact, precisely in this contamination, because oral sources are not found. Let me make a small digression. I talk about oral sources because this is the language you usually use, but let me make a distinction between the source and the document. The source is a subject that issues the language, spoken or written. The document is a recorded or written trace of that speech act. So to me, what is in the archives, and which is absolutely precious, as I've been saying, is not oral sources. They're sound document based on oral sources, and the oral sources are the people. And this generates a complex relationship between the document and the source. Because what makes the document, the sound file, the tape, the cassette, so precious is that it's still, it doesn't move. It's there. We can handle it. But the source, the person that originally told that story, is alive and keeps moving and keeps changing. So that what we have in our archives are like a still snapshot of a moving object. And will go back to this complicated tension between a moving source and the permanent object. But the question was, the oral document, the oral source, does not exist unless the historian generates it. And since we have a whole centuries of positivistic approaches in which the observer must not interfere with the object that is being observed, that was a scandal. And I remember, you know, the old-fashioned handbooks for social research, and they talked about the observer must be like a fly on the wall, invisible. Well, number one, a fly on the wall is not invisible. Number two, if I see a fly on the wall, my first question is, who opened the window and let the fly in? And my reaction is to squash it. So there's no way in which an observer can not interfere. But so the first response, 𝗏𝗏𝘃𝗀𝘃, Paul Thompson, you know, the great founders, some people call me one of the fathers of oral history. Okay, these are the grandfathers, they're my fathers. Their response was, wait a second, oral sources are just about as reliable as everything else. Do you take for granted that what is written in the archive is true? Of course not. And the same is with the oral sources. We can verify, we can cross-check, we can do all sorts of things. So and they also attempted to develop approaches in which somehow you didn't interfere, but the real turning point came when a number of different people, 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗶𝘀 in Canada, Ronald Greeley, Dennis Stedlock in the United States, Luisa Passerini in Italy, myself, began to say, wait a second, no, it's exactly the other way around. On the one hand, yes, we do need to make sure that we proceed with all the methodology, the established methods. We had to make sure that we have our sources right, that we have our bibliography. One of the criticisms was, you can't do oral history only with oral sources. But number one, I don't know anyone who seriously does oral history only with oral sources. But I know a lot of professional historians that are still doing contemporary history only with written sources, ignoring the fact that there are sources all around them. So no. So on the one hand, there was this positive defensive response. No. What you're telling us is not true. We're just as serious as everybody else. On the other hand, we said, no, it's the other way around. Number one, the interview is not an attempt to extract some kind of pre-existing narrative from a human person. It's a cooperative encounter between different worlds, between academics and workers, men and women, young people and old people, black and white, worlds that would not have talked to each other. There's an important book by 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗏𝗏, who's a scholar of native North American cultures. And he talks about the autobiographies of great Native American leaders, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse. All these interviews, all these autobiographies were told to some white person, Black Elk. And so he says, what we have is not the purity, the abstract purity of the man. We have an encounter between worlds. We have a document of how a Native American war hero talks to a white person. And we have an account of how a working class woman may talk to an academic man. And perhaps my most important experience was when this fantastic African American lady told me, you know, my ancestors were slaves, and because of the stories I've heard about them, because you're white, I don't trust you. And I thought that was wonderful, because why should she trust me? I mean, I was friends of friends. You know, she trusted me enough to spend several hours of her life in 2 different sessions to explain to me why she couldn't trust me by telling me her story. And so the interviews, this exchange of gazes, which is infinitely richer than just any preset narrative. And reliability, on the one hand, we verify. On the one hand, I wouldn't be doing oral history. I wouldn't be here talking to you if the working class, the working people in the steelworks of 𝗏𝗏𝘀𝘀𝘀, my hometown, had not told me their story, getting all the dates wrong, getting a number of facts, of crucial facts, wrong. Which, because I'm not a historian, they were beautiful stories, but they were factually wrong. And because I was a professor of literature, not of history. In literature, I keep saying this over and over, you don't throw away a good story just because it isn't true. You just ask the question, what does it mean? And the same applies to psychoanalysis, which is one of the tools that Luisa Pastorini brought to our office. We talk about another definition of credibility, which includes imagination, which includes dream, desire, error. That is, which, to use Luisa Pastorini's keyword, which includes subjectivity. And we learn, and we taught our colleagues that subjectivity is a historical fact, immaterial, but with material consequences. And the same applies to memory. Memory is not just an easy metaphor. Memory is not the memory of the computer. Memory is the computer. Memory is, to talk about other electric materials. Memory is where the input is elaborated over time, where what is meaningless is discarded, and what is meaningful is constantly reinterrogated because another objection. Oral sources are not coeval. You interview people in 2019 about what happened in 1943. Okay. But then all the coeval documents of 1943 are totally unreliable, because what documents do you have of the resistance, which was underground, clandestine? They couldn't write. And what do you know about the unions by reading the police reports of the strikes? Maybe they didn't understand what was really going on. And in fact, right when something is happening, you may not know the meaning, what is really happening. something is happening here, but you don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones, to quote Bob Dylan? It takes time for Mr. Jones to know what happened. So memory, again, memory is not just the trace of the experience. Memory is the work that sets the relationship between the remembered time and the time of remembering. That is, if we talk in 2019 about 1943, what we get is the relationship, is the meaning of 1943 in 2019, and all the memories of the time between. So these are some of the things that we have been working on. And to go back to the question of there's a phrase that runs through my mind right now: electric dreams. This is Philip K. Dick, 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘀𝘀 dream of electric sheep. Okay, the electric dream of the sound archive, which is precious. But I have two images in mind. One is from a novel by Ishmael Reed, a great African-American writer of the 1960s. And he talks about the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he says, the Museum of Modern Art is the world's greatest art detention center. And I'm thinking about how often museums, libraries, archives are averse to allowing people to access their collections, our precious collections, art detentions. And the founder of the Sound Archive was the chief of Gianni Bosio, 𝗍𝗶𝘀𝘀𝘀𝘀. On the first day in which we announced the creation of the archive, he had this wonderful image that it has become sort of a mantra for us. He says, what is the archive? The archive is a room. In the room, there's a closet. And inside the closet are 2,000 voices screaming, we want to get out, we want to get out. So the task of the archive is, once the voices are inside, they should not remain frozen. They should not remain detained. They should come out. They should come out. And they can come out in thousands of ways. They can come out in books. They can come out in websites, in podcasts, records, concerts, theater, but they must come out. They must come out. Because only when the voices come out, will the original sources realize what we have done with their voice, which is not giving them voice. I have not given voice to anyone. I have received voice, because if the people who hadn't been talking or singing for me and into my tape recorder, I would not have been able to write a line. So my voice, I have received a voice. But what have I given in exchange? Well, I have listened, number one, which working people, peasants, women, old people, they all have children, they all have voices. But the usual complaint is nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. So what we do primarily is listen, which means, for one thing, that the practice of oral history, the oral history interview is always open. You go into the interview because there are things that you want to know. But the person talks to you because they have things that they want to say, no matter what you're asking. And you have to be extremely flexible. I can't resist telling you another anecdote. I'm trying to shut up, but this anecdote, when I realized that the workers in Terni were giving me inaccurate but very meaningful versions of their stories, I decided to do an oral history project to find out what happened between 1949 and 1953 in the town of Terni and how it was being remembered. First interview. I talked to a factory worker and he gives me an interesting narrative. And then his wife grabs a microphone and she tells me a story about her great-grandfather who on his wedding day left his wife at home to join with Giuseppe Garibaldi, the liberator of Italy, and follow him to fight and liberate Italy, and he came back 4 years later. So what do you do? I have a project that says 1949 to 1953. Do you say, sorry, this is not, or, well, what I finally did, but my book is an oral history of Terni from 1821 to 2014. And because this is an encounter of subjectivity, because you're offering the space, because you're giving an opportunity, not just to talk, but to being heard. And that was one thing. And the other thing was, all right, I spent like 10 years doing this oral history of my first volume of my oral history of Terni. And people always say, your task is to return it to the community. Well, the community was not interested for two reasons. One, they already knew the stories. I mean, that's where they came from. They already knew the stories. Number two, and it took them a long time to accept the ways in which I was telling their stories, because I was telling them the way they told them in dialect, and they wanted to appear that they thought I was making them look ignorant. It took them some time before they realized I was making them sound eloquent. But when some of them realized what I had done was when the standard history of the Italian resistance by 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝗀𝗀 quoted their interviews from my book, because what we're giving them is not returning the narrative to the community, which is okay. I mean, you put it in an archive and people will use it, but bringing the story out of the community. Because the community has a narrative, but the world isn't listening to it. So you bring the story out. You not only you listen, but you make the people and the stories that you listen to part of the general discourse, part of the paradigm of history. So this is what I think I would like to say as a way of introduction. So now let's have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much. I will ask you some questions, first in Portuguese for our public and after in English, okay?
Okay.
Eu agradecia para o ao professor Portelli e expliquei que eu faria umas perguntas primeiro em português, depois em inglês. Bom, vamos lá. A pergunta é a seguinte: o seu trabalho chama atenção para a dimensão dialógica e para a intersubjetividade que envolve a arte da escuta. Você também destaca o processo contínuo de elaboração e reconstrução dos significados que são próprios do trabalho da memória. Podemos dizer que a compreensão desses elementos, que são motivo de resistência, né, de historiadores mais conservadores em relação à história oral, é exatamente, né, a compreensão desses elementos é exatamente o que torna a metodologia especial para a pesquisa histórica. Bora fazer em inglês para o professor. You draw attention to dialogic dimension and the intersubjectivity that are involved in the art of listening. You also highlight the ongoing process of elaboration and reconstruction of meaning in the work of memory. Can you say that these elements, the subjective and the memory stability, are the reasons for the resistance for more conservative historians in relation to the oral history? And can we also say that they are, in your opinion, exactly what makes oral history a special methodology of historical research? Can you say that?
Yes, I would definitely say this. My first article was what makes oral history different, and it was all about the different credibility, the dialogics, the sound environment, and the point that I made in that article, I still think it's valid. That is, the fact that we recognize the existence of oral history somehow undermines the certainties of all historical work. Because one thing about oral history, about oral sources, the documents, you can read all the documents, listen to all the tapes, but we can never exhaust the sources. And if we're doing say, a history of the COVID pandemic right now, who do we interview? Because this affects everybody. And there's no way that a statistical sample can really tell us what we need to know, which is how does the pandemic affect our minds? How do you do this? Technically, you ought to interview the whole of mankind. Number two, once you've finished interviewing all of mankind, you should do it again. Because you interview somebody today, by the time you've interviewed 100,000 people, it takes a couple of years. In a couple of years, that first person you interviewed has changed. So the constant flux can't be stopped, which means that oral sources are intrinsically temporary, hypothetical. But because no serious historian today ought to even think of doing contemporary history. I mean, are you going to do the history of the pandemic based on the archives? What's in the archives? So no serious contemporary historian ought to think of doing contemporary history without the oral sources. And because oral sources are intrinsically partial, temporary, influence, movable, this means that all history is intrinsically temporary, hypothetical, problematic. And on the one hand, see, this is an exchange. On the one hand, we have learned from professional historians how to verify our sources. On the other hand, we have been telling historians, all your sources are like ours, incomplete, temporary, provisional. There's no such thing as the definitive work on anything. on anything. So this, of course, would excite a progressive historian and would probably be perceived as a serious threat by more conventional ones, who in fact pretend that all of this does not exist, that we haven't done anything.
Okay, thank you. So, another question, first in Portuguese. Você afirmou... Queria te perguntar o seguinte: as novas tecnologias e a pandemia, elas impuseram aos pesquisadores novas maneiras de se relacionar com as suas fontes, de acessar os relatos dos seus entrevistados, entrevistas por Zoom, por exemplo, né? Você poderia comentar sobre como essa mediação tecnológica impacta a relação entre entrevistado e entrevistador e na maneira de fazer história oral? Então, now in English. New technologies and pandemic of COVID-19 imposed to researchers new ways of relation to people. Zoom interview, for example. In your opinion, how this kind of technological mediation impacts the oral history interview?
Well,
in your opinion, what's the importance of face-to-face?
Well, yeah, I was because the object of your research is always in flux. At the beginning of 2020, I was starting on a new project in Terni to find out, what happened since, because there have been radical changes. And then the lockdown came. And of course, I couldn't go there. And I haven't been able to bring myself to do interviews online. A number of colleagues, there's a whole network of oral historians that are talking about this. And a number of colleagues say, well, they either say, well, it's better than nothing, which I absolutely agree with. And also, well, somehow it generates a different kind of relationship, which I think is interesting. I myself feel that I haven't, that the face-to-face interview implies so many other elements of implies the fact that that you've left your home and traveled to that person's space. You are in their space, which means a number of rituals. For instance, the typical case, would you like a cup of coffee? And and well, where do you sit in that space? Which isn't, all of these are ways of setting a personal communication. I must have done like 50 webinars since 2000, and it's wonderful that we can do this. But I have all these black squares on my screen, and somehow you have a sense that fortunately I can see you, and I can see when your response to what I say. So I'm experiencing this as a conversation between us too, because you're the one that I see. and I guess, you know, in the States, they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I'm an old dog, and I still do things the old way. I've been waiting for the pandemic to end so that I can go back, but it keeps dragging on and on. And meanwhile, the place has changed again. From what it was in 2020, when I was doing this in January, February 2020, and that was before the pandemic. If I go now, it's after or during the pandemic. It's another place altogether. It's another project. So I think, you know, this new way of this informal exchange allows us to do things that we could not have done before. But we gain something, the distance. I mean, I don't have to get on a plane to come and talk to you, which is also much cheaper. But we lose something. We lose the physical element, which, you know, I always finally I boil it down to the words, which is immaterial, but the words come out of the physical account, and the fact that you put some physical effort, you get on your car and you travel, you climb stairs, you know, that generates, I think, a different form of personal involvement. So I'm glad that it's possible to do interviews in this format, but I haven't been able to bring myself to do it. Basically, I think I'm wrong. It's a mistake, but that's the way it is.
Okay, thank you. One more question, in Portuguese first. Você afirmou nos seus livros que o que há de mais importante sobre a natureza dialógica do trabalho com história oral é que ele precisa encontrar maneiras de ser útil aos indivíduos e às comunidades envolvidas, né? Você poderia desenvolver essa ideia? Quer dizer, de que maneiras podemos ser úteis aos indivíduos e essas comunidades? Então, in English now. You said in one of your books that one of the most important thing about dialogical nature of oral history work is that it needs to find ways to be useful to individuals and communities involved. Could you develop this idea for us? How we can be useful to them?
I missed a few words. Can you say it again, Kirina? Okay,
of course. You said that one of the most important things about the dialogical nature of the oral history work is that it needs to find ways to be useful to individuals and communities involved in it. So I could ask you to develop this idea. So how could we, interviewers, be useful to the individuals and the communities? How can you do that?
Well, there are different levels. On the one hand, I have this friend and comrade who was one of the leaders of the resistance in Rome, who I've done about like 30 hours of interviews with him, and he always conceived of me as just a tool for telling his story. You know, often, you know, people have a story that they want to tell, but they don't necessarily have the tools for telling the story. So, so you provide this opportunity. In that case, you know, you are a tool for someone else's narrative project. On the other pole, something happens at the very time of the interview. That is, because the interview is an encounter between differences. Well, this may be the first, like, I remember just one example. I was doing this project on the Nazi occupation of Rome, and I realized that I also needed to talk to fascists. I mean, you don't do the history of a war if you only listen to one side. Not because I wanted to be neutral, but because I wanted to be objective. Because and I wanted to have. So one day I just rang the bell at a very, very infamous fascist local that we were all afraid of. You know? So I went and knocked on the door. Two young people opened the door, and I said, I'm a left-wing historian. I'm doing this project. Can I talk to you? And they just said, welcome. Because I had never spoken to a young fascist, and they had never spoken to a leftist. So this was truly a moment in which both of us were challenged. And I think we came out of the interview different, not because we had converted anyone, but because we had become more aware of why we were what we were. So, because you ask questions, you raise subjects which perhaps the interviewee has never really thought about before. So you generate a level of self-awareness that may not have been there before. On the other hand, the way you're talking to a difference, and this generates a different awareness of yourself. The example I was giving, the lady who told me, I don't trust you because you're white, I don't trust you. Okay, why should she trust you? I'm white, she's black, I'm male, she's a woman, I'm European, she's American, I'm middle class, she's a coal miner's wife. I'm not religious, she's a devout Baptist. I'm young, I was young, she was old. Why should she trust me? I mean, of course, I'm anti-racist and everything, but if the color of the skin became a matter of life and death, it's not just a matter, could she trust me? Could I trust myself? And then this reflected back on the history I was working on. Because if in 1930, if I had been there in 1938, when the Italian state declared that Jews were not citizens, expelled all Jewish children from our schools. If I had been a student in one of those schools, would I have done the right thing? So you question the other person, but the other person's story questions you, and you come out changed. So this, you have these two extremes, and then of course it's useful because it changes. It helps change what we know about about the world we live in, and therefore, it helps us orient ourselves in the world in which we live. This is the function of all, I think, all kinds of historical and social work. So maybe that. Certainly, it's not a tool for propaganda, never. In fact, one of the main obstacles that we found in the Italian oral history movement came from the established left-wing historians, communist historians, because we were not telling the story of the working classes in a way that was functional to the party narrative, or to the party. And so that's the kind of usefulness that no, we don't have. But I think we would have been much more useful if they had listened to us and changed the party narrative and the party life.
Thank you. I would like to ask you another question about something that is important in your work, is how to lead with stories of suffering and trauma. Só traduzindo aqui para as pessoas, eu estou perguntando para ele sobre uma questão que é central na sua reflexão, que é sobre como lidar com histórias de sofrimento e trauma. Can you talk about that with us?
Yeah, I'm not too comfortable with the concept of trauma because I don't know enough. I mean, it's a scientific concept. It's a medical concept, and I don't have I only have a very vague idea of what it really means. So how do you deal with stories of people who have suffered dramatic events in the course of their lives, basically? And the case of my work on the 𝗤𝗏𝘃𝗀𝘀 massacre, in which I interviewed the survivors, the wives, the daughters of the men who had been killed by the Nazis in 1944, which was a traumatic narrative. A traumatic event, you could tell because the wound was still open and raw, because people broke down and they told the story as if it just happened. So how do you do it? Well, number one, you do it by ear, because it's different in each case. Well, one thing that oral history might be a methodology, it certainly is not a technique. I don't think it's even a method. I think it's a specific field of research. And you had people that were only waiting for the opportunity to talk about it. You had people who refused to talk about it. And you had people, one of my best friends, as a matter of fact, who I didn't know was connected to that. I never mentioned it. She was a close friend, and her father had been killed. So she asked me to interview her because she had never talked about it to her children. And she used the interview with me as a general rehearsal for finally telling the story so that she could talk to her children. So I think the only way that I've dealt with this has been, as an extension to maybe the only technical advice I have to give to fulfill good manners be polite. Be polite. Therefore, do not be intrusive. You are in their space. Back to the other question. You're in their home. You're drinking their coffee. You're sitting on their sofa. Please, you're a guest. And even if you're not in their home, you're a guest in their time. And they're giving you their knowledge. So be polite. Don't be intrusive. Just find ways of letting people know that you're willing to listen. And possibly find it in implicit, not explicit. It's not that whatever you want to tell me, you can. That's terrible. No. Okay. 2 little stories, and then I shut up. One, someone suggested in Kentucky, I was doing this work on coal miners in Kentucky. Someone suggested that I interview this man, Vivian, who had been in Vietnam and had stories to tell about the war in Vietnam. But my friend, who was his friend, said she would not talk about Vietnam if his mother is there. So his mother was there. So if I had been one of those great journalists, 𝗤𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, who pride themselves in being able to extract things from people, I would have said, were you ever in Vietnam? What I did was, I asked him, were you ever in the service? Were you ever in the military? So that he knew. Well, in fact, he knew that I knew. But he knew that if he wanted to talk, he could. He said, no, never. Then, for another reason, I went back a couple of hours later. I had forgotten something. He went back, rang the bell. He came out. His mother wasn't there. He said, you know, I said I had never been in the army, but actually I was. I spent 7 years in Vietnam. I said, would you talk to me about it? And it was a traumatic narrative, traumatic for me. So the reason he told me the story was that I did not ask. He knew that I knew because he knew that his friend that introduced me to him, not to told, he knew that I knew, and he knew that I had respected the story. Another story was one of the wives of the victims of the 𝗤𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 massacre. They had killed her husband of 6 months and 4 other relatives. And but at the end of the interview, when I had asked all my questions and she had told all the stories that she thought she had to tell, we were just chatting. And she mentioned that, she said, you know, afterwards, whenever you went to find a job, they thought you were at their disposal. So I said, Madam, what do you mean? And she said, I mean, what do you know I mean? That is, as a young widow, she was subjected to sexual harassment. Men thought that she was legitimate prey. So, question, how do you generalize? Was she just, this was very traumatic for me because as a male, this is about me. This is not about some abstract Nazi or fascism. This is about me. So how do you generalize? And I remember in the other interviews that I did, I mean, you don't ask an old lady, Madam, were you ever sexually harassed? I would say something like, it must have been difficult for a young woman back there. They all knew what I meant, and they all had stories like this. They all had stories like this. But they could have just said, yes, I didn't have a job. Yes, I had small children. So I think the only way is you don't interfere, you don't intrude. You let people know that you're there, they're willing to listen. And you always remember one thing: the oral history interview is not a therapeutic experience. You're not there to cure people because you don't know how to do it. You're there to listen and try to make sense of what they tell you.
Thank you, Professor. We have here, nós temos aqui uma pergunta do público. We have here a question from public, so I read it in Portuguese and after I translate to you. A 𝗔𝗶𝘀𝗀𝘀𝗀 pergunta, professor Portelli, poderia comentar um pouco sobre como o senhor, ocorre para o senhor o processo de evolutiva aos que participam na construção da história oral dos seus projetos? He asked, Lourdes Soares asked you, asked you if you could comment a little on how the feedback process takes place to those who participate in your project of oral history. Did you understand?
Well, feedback and yes. Well, it's been more or less what I was talking about earlier. That is, well, number one, after I did my first interviews, I thought that the correct thing was to send people their transcript and the transcript of the interview. And I realized that it wasn't really working. Number one, they already knew the story, so they weren't interested in reading. Number two, a lot of them were not necessarily readers, especially in the United States. A number of people that I interviewed could not read. So, you know, this piece of paper lay on the shelf from birth. Others said, this is not the way I talk. This is typical. I have the same reaction when I see a transcript of my orality. Didn't they talk that way? Yes. And so there was this rejection. So what I've been doing lately, thanks to electricity and technology, I've been sending them the sound file so that so they can hear themselves. And I think it's also better, you know. They have, I've been sending them the recording. Well, incidentally, I never publish a line without first trying to submit it to the original source. And if they ask me to change it, I change it because it's their property. It's their property. As for feedback in more general terms, especially the former anti-fascist partisans, fighters in those what's fought in the resistance, they felt that my work had validated them. They felt that they had been reinforced and validated. And in the long run, this has also happened with the steel workers in Terni. That is, they've, you know, as I was saying, the first reaction was indifference or this is not how we talk. It has taken them a long time before they recognized that this was them, that this was their history. And so that now essentially the book went out of print before the city of 𝗤𝗏𝘃𝗀𝘀 could adopt it. So we had to do another edition. So, but typically, as right now, as 𝗤𝗏𝘃𝗀𝘀 has changed radically, and the bourgeoisie, the right wing, has taken over, now my narrative, my history is under attack. They're talking about, oh, this is Portelli and others have created the myth of the working class in 𝗤𝗏𝘃𝗀𝘀. Well, the myth. That's why the city exists, but they're replacing it with other myths, and so we're reopening the discussion. In the case of Harlan, Kentucky, this was more complicated because, number one, the book came out with an academic press, and it's expensive, and not many people could afford. Number one. Number two, there's a 30% illiteracy rate in Harlan County. Not there's no bookstore in Harlan County for selling of books. So it was a great, great, thrilling moment when I was with my wife. The first time she went to Harlan County with me, and we were sitting in a restaurant, and we were talking, my wife and I, in Italian, and this man gets up and says, "Are you the person that wrote that great book on us?" And of course, well, somebody has read the book and liked it in Harlan. But what I think I've done is that I've helped a number of very interesting cultural workers in Harlan County refine their awareness of the history of the county and of the usability of oral sources. So that there are interesting works going on in Harlan, like turning oral narratives into theater. And I don't think it's because of me, but I think I've helped a little bit to generate that kind of awareness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you very much in the name of Memória 𝗏𝗏𝘀𝘀. It was a great pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much.
And the pleasure has been mine. As you know, I care about these things, so I'm so glad you gave me an opportunity to share them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. E é isso, a gente termina por aqui essa sessão e à tarde, às 16 horas, a gente continua com a última sessão da memória, do Preserva-me 2021. Obrigada a todos que me seguiram aqui.
Obrigado.
Thank you.